So let's jump into it, man. Let's talk about what Wendell Ferreira and Brian Maffey talked about. I hope I'm pronouncing Brian's last name right. I think it's Maffey. He's a big athletic threshold guy, big draft coverage guy here for the Packers, and likes to kind of lay out, all right, here are the parameters that the Packers like to work within. You guys know how I feel. And I don't know how anybody who covers the threshold, maybe they disagree with Gutey as well. I'm like, man, give me the best football player. I don't care if this guy's 1 inch taller than that guy. Now, if they're in the same tier and you need a cluster buster, that's different, right? If you got a guy, let's say that you've got 3 cornerbacks that you like, right? And they're all in the same tier of talent. And you look at it and say, okay, how do we decide between these 3? If you want to use athletic threshold as the cluster buster, that's cool. I'm okay with that. And meaning like, okay, this guy meets all of our athletic thresholds. This guy only has 2. That guy only has 1. Let's go get that guy right there. Now, if you've got 3 cornerbacks, let's say, since cornerback is one of the top needs for the Packers this year in the draft, if you've got 3 cornerbacks that they all 3 meet the athletic threshold, okay, so you say, okay, man, they all 3 are in the same tier of talent. They all meet the same athletic threshold. Then you can move on to your second wave of cluster busters if athletic threshold is the most important. For me, it's not the most important thing, personally. Now, when you're talking about 40 time potentially being the cluster buster, that makes all the sense in the world. Maybe agility is. Maybe it's going back to the tape and ball tracking. Which one is the better ball tracker here, right? All those things can come into play as well. So, again, I don't look at athletic threshold like, oh, my gosh, it's so important that this matches up perfectly. However, like Brian and Wendell and these other guys have talked about year in and year out, you can tell it means a lot to Brian Gutekunst. Now, some would say at the detriment of the Packers that he puts too much emphasis on that type of stuff, right? But let's dive into it here again, and just a little excerpt from their article here with Wendell Ferreira. He said the Green Bay Packers must add cornerbacks both for depth and high-end talent, despite what General Manager Brian Gutekunst said publicly. Now, without a first-round pick and with the salary cap constraints, it may be hard to find a day one starter. Well, the good news is this draft class is perfectly aligned with what the Packers have, and in the area where they have enough capital to get it, because it's a strong day 2 class is what he's talking about here, okay? A strong day 2 class. Now, timeout, pause. That's what Wendell said, right? And just like me and anyone else, one person isn't the grand poobah, right? However, cross-check that. Former NFL scout Daniel Jeremiah, what did he say? A lot of day 2 starters at the cornerback position. Lines up perfectly with what Wendell Ferreira is saying here, okay? So as we go through here and look at some of the thresholds, and I had a report just kind of pulled here off the internet. Now, listen, some of these may be a little off in your eyes. Some people will say, well, no, they actually prioritize arm length over height, or maybe they prioritize height over weight, or maybe they prioritize 40-yard dash over height. I'm not doing a podcast. I'm not on social media to argue with people and trying to split hairs and having a pissing contest. It's just not how I fan, right? I would rather just hit mute and move on. That's just how I roll in that regard. So here are some of the metrics, okay, that understand this doesn't mean that this is follow this to a T, but this is a good little example. Threshold confirmation for cornerback, all right? So within the article that they wrote, right there, talking about some of the height, weight requirements and things like that, right? What we're going to do is show you the historical threshold, and as we move forward to other positions, we'll kind of give you a ballpark there as well. Okay, so height, you've got 5'10" and a half being the minimum, with 6 foot being ideal. The historical threshold, 5'10" and 1/8 of an inch is the minimum there at the cornerback position. Okay, weight, 190 pounds is the minimum, is what they're saying. 193 pounds is ideal, but the outlier, we have drafted players that were 184 pounds. So you can see the 190-pound threshold doesn't mean, nope, they're completely off the board if they're below that. It's just what do they like? What is the preference, right? And that's where we've got to really kind of decide where we want the athletic threshold to fall on our draft board. And I'll show you the board here in a second. Arm length, 31 inches, okay? Historical threshold at the minimum, 31 inches. 40-yard dash, 4.55. is the max, okay? But they're looking for ideally sub 4.540. Okay. Now, in the 4.5s, what was the outlier? You guys remember Jackson? I'm trying to think of his name. Who was it? Josh Jackson, right? Yeah, right there it is, right there. The Josh Jackson rule. So Josh Jackson was very high on people's draft boards. Some people thought he was going to be a first-round pick, and he kept dropping and dropping, right? So why did the Packers reach outside of their normal threshold to get Josh Jackson, who ran a 4.56? Because he was probably so high on their board, it made sense at the time. All right, we're going to take him in spite of the 40-yard dash, right? And that's what I'm talking about. You got to be kind of flexible in that regard. 3-cone drill. 6.96 is the max, ideally 6.86. And of course, the historical threshold and the minimum, they were willing to go in the 7s in the past, according to this report. Okay, so you got the Josh Jackson rule. Josh Jackson, the source confirms that Josh Jackson, 4.56, remains the only cornerback drafted by Gutekunst to exceed the 4.50 mark. And his lack of success has reinforced the need for speed. So again, that was when they went outside of that threshold a little bit, and it did not work out. Really surprising that Josh Jackson wasn't a better football player. He had a ton of interceptions. I want to say he played for Iowa. We're going back some time now. But I was excited about the Josh Jackson pick. It did not work out, obviously. Agility over explosion. While the Packers generally love explosive testers, which is basically a combination of broad jump and vertical jump, that gives you your explosion grade. The first time I ever heard explosion grade mentioned was way back in the day with Pat Kerwin, former executive with the Jets, who went on to do Moving the Chains on Sirius NFL Radio in its early days. He always talked about explosion grade. If you guys have read the book, Take Your Eye Off the Ball, which I've recommended many, many times to listeners like, hey, man, I want to start diving into football a little deeper. Start there. It may be too light for you, but you get through that book, now you're ready to take the next step and go, okay, let's really press in and geek out over football. So he talked about explosion grade there. That's a combination of broad jump and vertical jump, all right? Also, the article highlighted that for cornerbacks, they specifically prioritize 3-cone agility to ensure they can mirror receivers in man coverage. So maybe that is the top. According to Brian Maffey and, of course, Wendell Ferreira, that's one of the top things that's on their list, if that makes sense. So that is a look at the cornerback spot. Okay, now they mentioned in their article here, I'm going to drop this down for just a second. They mentioned in their article that they have earmarked a handful of day 2 cornerbacks, and that's what I wanted to get to on this particular segment here. They've got some day 2 cornerbacks that they've kind of earmarked. Now you're going to notice that on our board, we're going to start to add heart eye emojis. Okay, what does that mean? That means Gutey has got the googly eyes, the old googly eyes for these specific players. And these are the players that Maffey and, of course, Wendell Ferreira mentioned. All right, Chris Johnson, surprise, surprise, at the top of the list here, right? Saying he may be available at 52. Now listen, this doesn't mean that these other guys that are ranked higher won't have the threshold emoji, okay? This just simply, they're talking about day 2, potential day 2 picks, 2nd and 3rd round picks, okay? At the top of the list, Chris Johnson, he checks the boxes. We got a 36.1 grade on him, which means he's worthy of the 36th pick. However, he's probably a little bit higher than that on our board last I checked. 34 is actually where he sits on our board, okay? So notice D'Angelo Pons isn't mentioned, right? Now, again, this isn't personal preference. I've been very vocal about this. I love football players. I love good football players who are going to go out there and lay the freaking pop on offensive players. I love guys who have good football instincts. I don't want to say I could care less about size. Again, if it's a cluster buster, I'm all about it, okay? If you've got D'Angelo Pons and Chris Johnson are sitting there, Chris Johnson's higher on our board and he meets the athletic threshold. If they've got the same grade, which they don't, let's say they did, I would go with Chris Johnson over D'Angelo Pons because it matters. It does. However, if D'Angelo Pons was 2 tiers higher than Chris Johnson and he doesn't meet the athletic threshold, me personally, I will go get D'Angelo Pons, okay? Because how many times have we drafted freaks? You guys remember Kevin King and his height? Wow, look how tall this corner is. Holy cow. Cheeks. So why did we reach? Why did we go get him? What did we fall in love with there? The tape wasn't off the charts enough to be one of the premier cornerbacks. It's because he had that height. He had that arm length, right? If I remember correctly, his arm length matched with his height. But nonetheless, that's what we mean by Gutey. Just because we like a guy on our board, just because they're higher on our board. Like, let me give you an example here. One of the guys that was mentioned in the article was Brandon Cease. I think that's how you say his name, out of South Carolina, cornerback out of South Carolina. Now, it's a perfect example. Now, I think Brian even mentioned in the article that he did not like his fluidity. He liked fluidity, so he wasn't like one of his personal favorites, but he did mention him as a potential threshold fit. So, for example, if D'Angelo Pons is sitting there at 52 and we got a 40.4 grade on him, and Brandon Cease is sitting there at 52, we got a 46.3. Hands down, D'Angelo Pons is the better prospect on our board, right? He's a national champion, on and on and on and on, right? However, more times than not, Gutey would take a Brandon Cease over a D'Angelo Pons because the threshold is there. And that's where I disagree with Gutey. If they're in the same tier, I'm okay with it. But clearly, D'Angelo Pons, as it sits right now on February 23rd, D'Angelo Pons has a better draft grade on our board than Cease. I would take Pons. We know Gutey wouldn't. There's a good example. Now, moving along, Julian Neal's another name that's gotten mentioned, and 80.5 is his grade. So to me, personally, 52, too much of a reach. But at 84, Julian Neal's a name that keeps popping up. He gets the early emoji there in terms of the threshold. So Julian Neal is a player that I would keep my eye on around the 84 spot. Now, he may go to the combine and absolutely crush it. If he crushes it at the combine, you may see him spike up. Here's the beautiful thing about our board. Other people may say, oh, he's a first-round talent. The most he can get in terms of an RAS bonus, i.e. the combine/pro day bonuses, is 5 points. That would move him up at a maximum of 75.5. Some people may see him as a first-round pick. On our board, he will not reach any higher than a 75.5. And I love to keep it that way. And if people disagree with that, that's okay. We can agree to disagree. What you need to do is pull the consensus big board. You need to pull the PFF big board because they're constantly moving those guys way up and down, depending on the draft buzz. I'm not saying that's right or wrong. I want our board to stay steady, stay true, hold as true as possible to how people felt about these prospects as soon as the tape was fresh, right after the college football season. Now, some people haven't had a chance to dive into these prospects, and I get that. I don't care. I would rather err on the side of if they're at the top of our board, guys, if they're at the top of our board, and you're going to see some players go, wow, we got them way higher than other people do, right? Yeah, it's because we chose not to drop them down too far because they ran a weird-looking 40-yard dash. Let me give you an example. Kyle Hamilton. Kyle Hamilton looked like the perfect prospect to us. We were like, oh, my God, this guy's a top 3 talent in the draft. And for whatever reason, when he ran his 40-yard dash, he ran it kind of sideways, and people, oh, my gosh, he's going to sink on boards. Now, he obviously didn't sink too far, but it was enough to prevent him from being considered a top 3 talent in the draft. That was crazy to me. It's a perfect example. Now, if he scored a 0 on the RAS, he doesn't get penalized on our board. However, he doesn't get any kind of bonus, and other players are going to be getting bonuses and moving up past him. Hopefully that makes sense. So Julian Neal, another name to keep up with. Devin Marshall's another one they mentioned in the article, going to have good threshold. We got a 130.2 on him. We're talking 5th or 6th round for it to make sense for me. He obviously was at the East-West Shrine Bowl. Did not get any kind of bonus there, to the best of my knowledge. Another one mentioned is Will Lee. He's significantly lower at 163.3, maybe a late-round guy that the Packers may like because of his size and his threshold, obviously out of Texas A&M there. He was at the Senior Bowl as well. You're going down the list, way down the list. You got Thaddeus Dixon at 206.4. Charles Demings out of Stephen F. Austin. He is in the he's got a 223 grade for us. Colin Wright out of Stanford has got a 252.7 for us. Okay, so that's just a handful of names to keep an eye on that the Packers may have a really, really close grip in terms of maybe wanting to interview them at the combine and things like that. And we'll continue to add those cheese emojis in whenever the Packers do meet with those specific players. Now, the one thing I do want to mention, out of all those thresholds that we mentioned at the cornerback position that Wendell Ferreira and Brian mentioned in their article together, there's only one that had an All-Star Week bonus. Guess who it was? Chris Johnson. Chris Johnson, guys, is the name that keeps popping up this year where I go, man, if he's there at 52, and I don't know if he will be. He may not last that long, but if Chris Johnson out of San Diego State's there at 52, run the damn card. I'd be all about it. So that's a quick look at the cornerback position. If you guys are watching this video back later, let me know in the comments, how do you feel about the cornerback position and the thresholds that we just talked about? What do you think about Chris Johnson? Maybe you like Brandon Cease over Chris Johnson. Maybe you like Julian Neal over both those guys. Maybe you'd rather wait and try to get one of them a little later in the draft. Maybe it's a Devin Marshall out of NC State. Maybe it's Malik Muhammad, who doesn't necessarily meet the threshold on the surface, but the Packers have already met with him at the Senior Bowl. Let us know in the comments what you think. Hit that like button for us. Hit subscribe. Click the bell icon as well as we get closer to the NFL draft. We appreciate y'all.